He said it the way you'd mention the weather. Sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, in my own house, with a cup of coffee I had made for him, he looked at me and said that if I couldn't help cover the debt, it might be time for me to think about other arrangements. Other arrangements. In my own house. I didn't say anything right away. I've never been good at the sharp, fast answer. The kind my sister always had ready, the kind that stops people cold. I just looked at him. My son-in-law, the man my daughter had brought home 6 years ago, with that careful smile and the firm handshake he always gave men but not women. I looked at him, and I picked up my tea, and I took a sip, and I said I would think about it. I think about that moment a lot now. Not with anger, though the anger was there eventually. Mostly I think about how strange it is that the moments that change your life often look so ordinary. Just a kitchen, just a cup of tea, just a man telling you, very politely, that he had decided your home belonged to him. My name is Constance. No, wait. Let me start again, the way I should start, which is not at the end, and not at the explanation, but at the beginning of how I got to that kitchen table and why I was sitting on the wrong side of it. I moved to Kelowna from Hamilton in 1987. My husband Gord had taken a position with an irrigation company, and we packed up everything. Our daughter was 4. Our cat was ancient. I was 31 and certain that the Okanagan would be temporary. We'd go back east in 2 years, I told my mother. Maybe 3. We stayed 37 years. Gord died in the spring of 2019, April, a Tuesday. Pancreatic cancer, which he had kept from me for longer than I will ever forgive him, though I have made my peace with that. We had 8 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. 8 weeks is both an eternity and nothing at all. I know that now in a way I couldn't have explained before. The house was mine, 4 bedrooms on a half-acre, with a view of the lake if you stood on the back deck and craned your neck a little. Gord and I had paid it off in 2009. It was mine, and it was paid for, and it was the place where my daughter had grown up, where she had drawn horses on the walls of her bedroom when she was 6, and I'd been too tired to be angry about it, where Gord had built a deck with his own hands over 2 summers and a borrowed nail gun. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter, because that's what she is and what she was before all of this, and I don't want to lose sight of that. My daughter came back to Kelowna 8 months after her father died. She had been living in Calgary, working in marketing, and she came back with her husband and 2 large dogs and the story that Calgary hadn't worked out. The job market, she said. The cost of living. Her husband, whose name I will not use because I no longer believe names are something you earn without trying, had left a position she described only as not the right fit. I was lonely. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. Grief is one thing, but the specific loneliness of rattling around a 4-bedroom house alone in your mid-60s with a view of a lake you used to watch with someone, that's its own particular weight. When my daughter called and asked if they could stay for a little while, just while they got sorted, just a few months, I said yes before she finished the sentence. That was my first mistake, though I don't entirely regret it. They arrived on a Thursday with a moving truck. I had expected boxes. I had expected temporary. What I hadn't expected was that they'd brought everything, every piece of furniture, every appliance, the enormous sectional sofa that took up 2/3 of my living room and smelled like a wet dog before the dogs even got inside. I stood on my front porch, watching them unload, and I felt something I couldn't name yet. Not quite alarm, something quieter than that. The way you feel when a word you know perfectly well suddenly looks spelled wrong. My son-in-law, he worked in real estate, had always worked in real estate. He liked to mention this the way some men mention military service, as a credential that entitled him to opinions about everything. My son-in-law had very strong views about how a house should function. He would walk through my rooms, pointing out things: the water pressure in the second bathroom, the age of the furnace. He would say, "We should really look at that," the way people say "we" when they mean "you." I kept quiet. My daughter seemed happy. She had always needed someone decisive beside her. Gord had been decisive. I had watched her stick that out her whole life. And her husband was nothing if not decisive. I told myself it was just an adjustment period. I told myself it would settle down. It settled into something else. By the third month, my daughter's husband had begun referring to the house as our place, not in a slip-of-the-tongue way. Deliberately, to other people, when I was standing right there. "Come over to our place," he'd say on the phone. "We've got the room." He made a spare key for his brother without asking me. He signed the family up for a meal delivery service using the house's address and put his name as the primary contact. I brought it up with my daughter once, carefully. The way you have to be careful with the people you love. The way you calibrate everything, because you know the full weight of what you're risking. She told me he was just trying to feel at home. She told me I was being sensitive. She said it in the tone she had developed as a teenager, the tone that made me feel I was the unreasonable one for having noticed something. I let it go. I let several things go that year. The money came up in February, about 14 months after they'd moved in. My son-in-law sat me down in my own kitchen, in the chair I always sat in for 30 years, which meant I had to take the other chair, and he explained, calmly, the way you explain things to someone who might not follow easily, that there was a situation. The situation was $340,000. He had been involved in a real estate venture in Calgary. A development project, pre-construction condos. The kind of thing that sounds like an opportunity until it doesn't. The project had collapsed. There were 2 other investors and a contractor and a legal dispute that was already a year into the courts. He owed money he didn't have to people he didn't trust, and there was a judgment coming. He presented this to me with a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet, printed out and placed in front of me on the table with a pen. The column on the right was a number with my name beside it. I looked at that number for a long time, $340,000. He said the house could serve as collateral. He said it was a short-term bridge loan situation, very common in real estate. He'd walked dozens of clients through exactly this kind of arrangement. He said it would be repaid within 18 months, 24 at the outside. He said it was really the only option that made sense given the timeline. He said if I wasn't able to help, they would need to think about what came next. He used the words "other arrangements" and looked at me steadily, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived very quietly, that he was suggesting he and my daughter would leave, and that he expected the leaving itself to be a threat. I picked up the pen. I looked at the spreadsheet. Then I put the pen down. I said I needed to think. He said he understood completely, but that time was a factor. He said weeks, not months. I said I understood. I asked if he wanted more coffee. He said no. He took his spreadsheet and he left the kitchen, and I sat at that table for a long time after, looking at the view of the lake I could see from the window if I sat up straight. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't call my sister, who would have told me to throw them out that same evening. I didn't call my friend Marguerite. Wait, that name is taken. My friend, I'll call her my friend from book club. We'd known each other since 1993. She'd seen me through everything. I didn't call her either. I sat with it. I have learned, in 67 years, that the decisions you make while you're still in the feeling aren't always the right ones. Gord used to call it sleeping on the boil. You let the feeling run its course before you decide. It took me a long time to understand that patience isn't the same as weakness. It looks the same from the outside. That's the thing. It looks exactly the same. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched. That's all I did. I watched my son-in-law move through my house like a man who had already won. He rearranged the living room furniture without asking. He had someone come to look at the deck. Gord's deck, the one Gord had built over 2 summers with the borrowed nail gun, and told me the wood was a liability, that if anyone tripped he could be held responsible, that they should talk about replacing it. He said, "they," but he meant him. My daughter moved around all of this like weather moves around a mountain. She had stopped asking me how I was. She had started saying, "we," the same way he did. One evening I came downstairs and found her going through the filing cabinet in Gord's old study, the one I kept locked. And when I asked her what she was looking for, she said she was just trying to get organized, that it was really better if everyone knew where everything was. That was the moment. Not the spreadsheet, not the other arrangements. That moment, standing in the doorway watching my daughter go through her father's filing cabinet 8 months after he died, as if the things inside belonged to her by virtue of surviving him. I closed the door. I said, "Good night." The next morning I called a lawyer. I want to be careful here because I've thought about how to say this. I didn't go to the lawyer angry. I went because I realized, sitting in that kitchen the night of the spreadsheet, that I had been operating under a belief that turned out to be wrong. The belief that love is its own protection. That the people you love can't maneuver against you. That blood is a kind of contract. It isn't. I know that now. Blood is a relationship, and relationships have terms, and when the terms shift, the relationship shifts with them, and if you aren't paying attention, you will look up one day and find that the terms have changed entirely without your consent. My lawyer was a woman in her late 50s who practiced out of a small firm near the waterfront. She had kind eyes and a very direct manner, and when I sat across from her desk and explained the situation, she listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she picked up her pen and said, "Let's talk about what you actually own and how it's currently held." We talked for 2 hours. What I learned in those 2 hours changed the shape of everything that came after. The house, as it turned out, had a complication I hadn't fully understood. When Gord died, his portion of the property had passed to me through survivorship. We had held it as joint tenants, but there was a secondary provision in his will regarding our daughter, a small clause his lawyer had included as a matter of course, something about right of occupancy in extenuating circumstances. It had been boilerplate. It had seemed harmless at the time, because at the time we hadn't imagined this. My lawyer looked at it carefully and then looked at me and said, "This is not what your son-in-law thinks it is." I asked her what she meant. She said that the clause was narrow. It was specific. It applied to my daughter, not her husband. It was temporary, not permanent, and it had conditions attached that, in her opinion, had not been met. I asked if it meant he could use the house as collateral for his debts. She said absolutely not. I asked if it meant he had any claim on the property whatsoever. She looked at me steadily. "None," she said. I went home that evening and made dinner. I made the chicken and rice Gord liked, even though I was making it only for myself because I needed something familiar under my hands. My daughter and her husband were out. The house was quiet. I ate at the kitchen table with the lake in the window. And I thought about all the years I had sat at that table and all the years I had taken for granted that the table was mine. I decided that night what I was going to do. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed because they weren't dignified. I didn't sweep out of my house on a wave of certainty. I made a plan, and I followed it, and some days following it was very hard. The first thing I did was open a separate account at a different bank and redirect my pension deposits, CPP, OAS, and the small work pension from the school board, where I'd done administrative work for 11 years. My financial information had been left, by my own carelessness, in a place my daughter could access. I corrected that. The second thing I did was call my nephew, who lives in Vernon. He's my late brother's son, a good man, quiet in the way my brother was quiet. I asked if I could come and stay. He said of course. He didn't ask why. I said I'd explain when I got there. He said there was no need to explain anything. The third thing I did was spend one weekend going through Gord's filing cabinet myself. I found everything I needed. The property title, the will, the records from the estate. I made copies of everything and I put them with my lawyer. The fourth thing I did was wait for the right moment, which came on a Wednesday in April. My son-in-law had scheduled, as if it were his meeting to call, a family conversation for that evening. I knew what it was about, the spreadsheet, the deadline. He had mentioned twice that week that time was running out, in the way he mentioned everything, calmly, and with the implication that the problem was mine to solve. I got up that Wednesday morning and I packed a bag. Not everything, just what I needed for a few weeks. My good coat, my photographs. The small things Gord had given me over the years that I kept on the bedside table. I put the bag in my car before my daughter was awake. I went downstairs and I made coffee, and when my son-in-law came into the kitchen, I handed him a mug and I sat down at the table and I looked at him. He said he was glad we were going to get everything settled. I said I was too. I said I had spoken to a lawyer. He went very still in the way that certain people go still when a situation has shifted in a direction they hadn't prepared for. I told him, clearly and without any particular emotion, that the house was mine, that it had always been mine, that no provision in any document gave him or his debts any claim on it, and that I had met with my lawyer 3 times and was very confident in this. I told him that I was leaving for a few weeks to visit family, and that I expected that when I came back, the situation in the house would have changed. I told him the dogs needed to be kept off the deck. He started to say something about the clause in Gord's will. He had done his research, I'll give him that. He knew about the clause. I said my lawyer had reviewed it thoroughly. I said he was welcome to have his own lawyer review it as well, but that I was confident in her assessment and that I had already made arrangements with her regarding the property. He asked what kind of arrangements. I said that was between me and my lawyer. I picked up my tea. I stood up. I said I hoped he and my daughter would have a good day and that I'd be in touch. I walked out of my own kitchen, through my own front door, and I drove to Vernon. The weeks I spent at my nephew's house were strange and quiet, in a way I hadn't expected. I had been braced for crisis, for the phone ringing constantly, for confrontation. The phone did ring. My daughter called twice that first day, and both times I let her leave a message, and both times I listened to the messages later. Alone in the room my nephew had made up for me, with the small window that looked out onto his backyard and the apple trees he keeps meaning to prune. Her first message was angry. Her second message was frightened. By the end of the second week, something had shifted in the tone. She called, and she didn't mention the house or the money. She just asked if I was all right. She said she missed me. She sounded, for the first time in 2 years, like my daughter. I called her back. We talked for a long time. It was not an easy conversation, and I won't pretend it resolved everything, because it didn't. There are things between a mother and a daughter that don't resolve on a phone call, that take years, that might not fully resolve at all. But I told her I loved her. I told her that hadn't changed. I told her that I needed her to understand something. The house was not an asset to be leveraged. It was where her father had lived. It was where I still lived. It was mine. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know, Mum. I know." I don't know exactly what happened between her and her husband in the weeks I was gone. I don't know what conversations they had, or what he told her, or what she told him. I know that when I came back, when I drove up that driveway again on a Sunday evening, with the light coming off the lake in that particular late afternoon way it does in May. When I pulled up and walked to my front door, the locks had not been changed. I had half expected them to be changed. They were not. He was gone. His things were mostly gone, though there were still boxes. My daughter was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, and she stood up when I came in, and she looked like she hadn't slept well in a few weeks, and we didn't say anything for a moment. We just stood in the hallway of my house, the two of us, and then she stepped forward, and I held her, and it was complicated, and it was not complicated at all. I found out later, through my lawyer, through the property records, through a friend in Hamilton who follows these things, that the development project in Calgary had not gone well for him. The judgment came down in late May. He had no assets in his name that could satisfy it. The house, my house, was never his to offer. He had known that. I think he had always known that. I think the spreadsheet and the careful calm and the other arrangements had been a gamble, the way certain people gamble when they have very little left to lose. He had sat across my kitchen table and looked me in the eye, and he had bet on the particular grief of a woman who had just lost her husband, on the loneliness of an empty house, on the love I had for my daughter that I would not risk losing. He was not entirely wrong about the love. He was wrong about what I would risk to protect it. The deck is still standing. I walked out onto it the first morning I was back with my coffee, and I stood there the way Gord and I used to stand there, craning my neck just slightly to get the full view of the lake. The wood Gord cut and sanded and sealed with his own hands. No liability, no replacement needed. My daughter is not in the house anymore. She found a rental in town, which is better for both of us, which we both knew but neither of us said. She comes for dinner on Thursdays. We are rebuilding something. It is slow and it is real, and I think Gord, who was a patient man, would have recognized what it was. I get letters sometimes from people I don't know, a side effect of having shared pieces of this story, who ask how I found the courage to walk out of my own kitchen and drive away from my own house. I never know quite how to answer that, because it didn't feel like courage at the time. It felt like the only thing I could do that wasn't surrender, and surrender was not something I was willing to give him. He sat across my table and told me, in polished and reasonable language, that I had no choice. He was wrong about that, too. I had a choice. I made it quietly, and I packed a bag before sunrise, and I drove east to my nephew's house and sat in his spare room, and looked at apple trees for 3 weeks, and I came home to find my house exactly as it had always been, mine, waiting for me in the particular April light of the Okanagan, with the lake just visible if you stand on the deck and crane your neck. That is the thing about patience that people mistake for passivity. The quiet ones are watching. We are always watching, and when the moment comes, we know exactly what to do.